Son's new wife sued me to put her 6 kids from previous marriages in my will. Court revealed she was hiding thousands in undisclosed child support. Everyone. I'm Margaret, and today I want to share with you the most unbelievable story about family greed, deception, and how sometimes the truth has a way of coming out in the most unexpected ways. What started as a simple family disagreement about inheritance turned into a courtroom drama that exposed lies, fraud, and manipulation that went deeper than anyone could have imagined. By the end of this story, you'll understand why I say that sometimes the worst enemies can come from within your own family. Let me start by giving you some background about my family situation. I'm 72 years old, a widow who lost my husband of 45 years about 8 years ago. We worked hard our entire lives, saved diligently, and built up a substantial estate that includes our family home, investment properties, and a healthy retirement portfolio worth approximately $2 million. My husband and I always planned to leave everything to our only son, David, who is now 38 years old. David has always been a good son, responsible and caring, though perhaps a bit too trusting for his own good. He's had his share of relationship troubles over the years, including a divorce from his first wife about 5 years ago. That marriage produced my beautiful granddaughter, Emma, who is now 12 years old and the absolute light of my life. David has joint custody, and Emma spends every other weekend with me, which has been one of my greatest joys since my husband passed away about 2 years ago. David started dating someone new, a woman named Jessica who seemed nice enough at first. Jessica was 42 years old, a divorced mother who claimed to be struggling financially as a single parent. She had what she described as a complicated family situation with children from multiple previous relationships, but honestly, I didn't pry too much into the details initially. David seemed happy, and after his difficult divorce, I was just glad to see him smiling again. Jessica was very charming when I first met her, almost overly so. She would compliment everything about my house, my cooking, my jewelry, always making comments about how successful and well-off our family was. She asked a lot of questions about my late husband's business, our investments, and our family's financial history, which I found a bit odd, but David assured me she was just trying to get to know the family better. The first red flag should have been when Jessica started bringing her children around. She had told us she had a few kids from previous relationships, but it turned out to be 6 children ranging in age from 8 to 16, all from different fathers. Now, I want to be clear here, I have nothing against blended families or single mothers. Life happens, and people deserve second chances. But what bothered me was how Jessica seemed to present a different story every time we talked about her family situation. Sometimes she would say the fathers were deadbeat dads who never helped financially. Other times she'd mention that some of them paid a little bit in child support, but it was never enough to really help. She constantly talked about how hard it was to make ends meet, how she was struggling to pay rent on their small apartment, and how she worried about being able to provide for all these children. David, with his generous heart, started helping her financially almost immediately, within months of them dating seriously. David was paying for groceries, helping with rent, and even bought school clothes for several of her children. I watched my son drain his savings account trying to help this woman and her 6 kids, and while I admired his kindness, something didn't sit right with me about the whole situation. When David proposed to Jessica after about 18 months of dating, I tried to be supportive, but I also suggested they consider a prenuptial agreement. Given the complexity of her family situation and the significant assets David would eventually inherit, it seemed like a reasonable precaution. Jessica's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She was deeply offended, claimed I didn't trust her, and said that asking for a prenup proved that our family didn't really accept her children, despite my concerns. They got married in a small ceremony last year. I attended and tried to be welcoming to Jessica and her children. though I noticed she had very expensive tastes for someone who was supposedly struggling financially. Her wedding dress alone probably cost more than most people spend on rent. And she insisted on a honeymoon in Europe that David definitely couldn't afford on his teacher's salary. The real problem started about 6 months after the wedding. Jessica began making comments about family planning and the future of all the children. She would drop hints about how important it was that all the kids in a blended family feel equally loved and valued. At first, I thought she was just talking about making sure Emma felt included with her new step-siblings, which I completely understood and supported, but then Jessica started getting more specific. She would make comments about inheritance laws, about how unfair it was that some children might inherit more than others just because of when they were born or who their parents were. She started asking direct questions about my will, about my estate planning, and about what I intended to leave to whom. I tried to handle these conversations diplomatically, explaining that I had always planned to leave my estate to David, and that I trusted him to make good decisions about his family's future. I pointed out that David was my only biological child, and that my estate was something my husband and I had built together specifically to pass down to our son and his descendants. Jessica's reaction was not what I expected. She became increasingly agitated and argumentative, insisting that once she married David, her children became part of our family too, and that it was discriminatory and unfair for me to treat them differently from Emma. She started using phrases like legal family and talking about how stepchildren have rights too. The conversation that changed everything happened about 4 months ago during a family barbecue. Jessica had been drinking wine and became more confrontational than usual. She flat out told me that I needed to update my will to include provisions for all 6 of her children, not just Emma. She said it wasn't fair that Emma would inherit millions while her kids got nothing, especially since David was now their stepfather and legal guardian. When I tried to explain that my estate was meant for my biological family line and that David could certainly choose to help his stepchildren from his inheritance, Jessica exploded. She accused me of being selfish, old-fashioned, and discriminatory. She said I was playing favorites and that I was going to tear the family apart with my outdated thinking. The argument escalated quickly, with Jessica demanding that I either change my will immediately or face the consequences. When I asked what she meant by consequences, she said she had been talking to a lawyer and that she was prepared to take legal action if necessary to protect her children's rights. I was absolutely stunned. This woman had been in our family for barely a year, and now she was threatening to sue me over my own will. I told her that my estate planning was my business and that no court in the world would force me to leave money to children who weren't related to me. Jessica just smiled coldly and said, "We'll see about that." True to her word, Jessica filed a lawsuit 3 weeks later. The legal papers claimed that I was engaging in discriminatory practices against her children, that I was violating their rights as members of the blended family, and that my will unfairly favored Emma over her 6 children. She was asking the court to force me to divide my estate equally among all 7 children, which would have meant each child getting roughly $300,000 instead of Emma potentially inheriting the full amount through David. I was devastated, not just by the lawsuit, but by the fact that my own son was allowing his wife to sue his mother. When I called David to talk about it, he seemed torn and stressed. He said Jessica had convinced him that she was just trying to protect her children and ensure they had the same opportunities as Emma. He claimed he didn't want to be involved in the legal battle, but he also wasn't going to ask Jessica to drop the suit. I hired an excellent attorney, Robert Chen, who specialized in estate planning and family law. Robert assured me that Jessica's lawsuit was frivolous and had no legal basis, but he warned that we'd still have to go through the process of defending against it, which would be expensive and emotionally draining. As we prepared for court, Robert suggested we conduct thorough discovery to understand Jessica's true financial situation and motivations. If she was going to claim that her children needed my inheritance due to financial hardship, we needed to examine whether that hardship was real or manufactured. This is where the story gets really interesting. Robert hired a private investigator to look into Jessica's background, her employment history, and her financial records. What we discovered was absolutely shocking and changed everything about the case. First, we found out that Jessica wasn't nearly as financially struggling as she had led everyone to believe. She owned 2 rental properties in a neighboring state that generated significant monthly income. She also had a substantial savings account and investment portfolio that she had never mentioned to David or our family, but the biggest bombshell came when we discovered the child support situation. Remember how Jessica always claimed that the fathers of her children were deadbeats who either paid nothing or very little in child support? That was a complete lie. Through court records and financial documentation, we found out that Jessica was receiving significant child support payments from multiple fathers totaling over $8,000 per month. That's nearly $100,000 per year in child support alone, which she had never disclosed to David or anyone in our family. Even more shocking was the discovery that she had been actively hiding this income through a complex web of bank accounts and financial arrangements. She had set up accounts under different names, had checks sent to P.O. boxes, and had even been using her mother's address for some of the payments to keep them hidden from David. But wait, it gets worse. We also discovered that Jessica had been claiming to be a single mother on various government assistance applications and had been receiving benefits that she wasn't entitled to, given her actual income level. She had been committing welfare fraud while simultaneously receiving thousands of dollars monthly in child support and rental income. The private investigator also uncovered something else that explained a lot about Jessica's behavior. This wasn't the first time she had targeted a wealthy family through marriage. She had apparently done something similar with one of her previous husbands, a man who owned a successful construction business. In that case, she had tried to get him to adopt her children legally so they would have inheritance rights to his estate. When he refused and they divorced, she had sued him for increased alimony and child support, claiming he had promised to provide for all her children. Armed with all this information, Robert prepared for what he called the most satisfying court case of his career. Jessica and her attorney had no idea what was coming. The court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in family court. Jessica showed up dressed like she was attending a funeral, clearly trying to play the part of the struggling single mother. She had her attorney present documents about the children's needs, their educational expenses, and projections about future costs. Her attorney gave an emotional opening statement about blended families, equal treatment, and the responsibility that comes with wealth. Jessica took the stand and gave what I can only describe as an Oscar-worthy performance about her financial struggles, her fears for her children's futures, and how unfair it was that Emma would have opportunities that her kids wouldn't have. She talked about how she had to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, how she sometimes had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, and how she laid awake at night worrying about how she would ever be able to send her children to college. She even cried a few times during her testimony, talking about the sacrifices she had made as a single mother. Then it was Robert's turn, and he absolutely destroyed her. He started by presenting the bank records showing Jessica's hidden accounts and the monthly child support payments totaling over $8,000. The look on Jessica's face when those documents were presented was priceless, pure shock and panic. Robert methodically went through each lie Jessica had told. He showed the court records of her property ownership, her rental income, her investment accounts, and her actual net worth, which was well over $400,000. He demonstrated how she had been systematically deceiving not just our family, but government agencies and the court itself. The most damaging evidence was the documentation of her welfare fraud. Robert showed that Jessica had been claiming poverty and single mother status to receive benefits while simultaneously collecting substantial child support and rental income. She had been committing multiple felonies while suing me for access to my estate, but Robert wasn't done. He also presented evidence of Jessica's pattern of targeting wealthy men for financial gain, including documentation from her previous marriage and divorce proceedings. He painted a clear picture of a woman who used her children as pawns in elaborate schemes to extract money from the men she married. Jessica's attorney was clearly blindsided by all this evidence. They had obviously not done their due diligence in investigating their client's background or verifying her claims. The attorney actually asked for a recess to confer with Jessica, and when they returned, Jessica looked like she had seen a ghost. The judge was not amused by what had been revealed. Not only did he dismiss Jessica's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she could never file it again, but he also ordered her to pay all of our legal fees, which had amounted to over $30,000. More importantly, the judge indicated that he was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution related to the welfare fraud and perjury charges. Jessica had committed multiple felonies, and the evidence was overwhelming. But the story doesn't end there. The revelation of Jessica's deception and fraud had immediate consequences for her marriage to David. When David learned the full extent of his wife's lies and manipulation, he was devastated. He realized that their entire relationship had been built on deception and that Jessica had been using him as much as she was trying to use me. David filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the court hearing. He also discovered that Jessica had been forging his signature on financial documents and had opened credit accounts in his name without his permission. She had stolen thousands of dollars from him during their marriage, money that he had thought was going to help support her struggling children. The divorce proceedings revealed even more of Jessica's deceptive practices. It turned out that she didn't even have full custody of several of the children she claimed to be supporting. 2 of them were actually living with their fathers most of the time, but Jessica continued to collect child support for them by claiming they lived with her full-time. Jessica's world completely unraveled after the court case. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts of welfare fraud, perjury, and identity theft. The district attorney's office discovered that her fraudulent activities had cost taxpayers over $50,000 in improper benefits over several years. Her ex-husbands, the fathers of her children, also started taking legal action once they learned about her deception. Several of them filed motions to modify custody and child support arrangements, arguing that Jessica had been misrepresenting her financial situation to inflate their support obligations. The rental properties that Jessica owned were seized as part of the criminal proceedings, and she faced the possibility of significant jail time and restitution payments. Her elaborate financial schemes had finally caught up with her, and the consequences were severe. As for David, he was understandably devastated by the whole experience. He had genuinely cared for Jessica and her children, and learning that it had all been an elaborate con game was heartbreaking. He felt guilty about allowing Jessica to sue me, and we had several long conversations about forgiveness and family trust. I was hurt by David's initial support of Jessica's lawsuit, but I also understood that he had been manipulated by a very skilled con artist. Jessica had spent months conditioning him to believe her stories and see her as a victim who needed protection. The fact that he immediately filed for divorce when he learned the truth showed me that his heart was in the right place, even if his judgment had been clouded. Emma, my granddaughter, was also affected by all this drama. She had grown attached to some of Jessica's children during the brief period when they were step-siblings, and she was confused and sad when that relationship ended so abruptly. We had to have age-appropriate conversations about how sometimes adults make bad choices that affect children, and how important it is to always tell the truth. The legal bills from defending against Jessica's lawsuit ended up costing about $30,000, but Jessica was court-ordered to reimburse me for those costs. Whether she'll actually be able to pay, given her legal troubles and the seizure of her assets, remains to be seen. More importantly, this whole experience taught our family valuable lessons about trust, due diligence, and the importance of protecting yourself from people who might try to take advantage of your generosity. David now understands why I suggested a prenuptial agreement, and he's committed to being more careful about future relationships. I've also updated my will to include some additional protections and provisions, not because of Jessica's lawsuit, but because the whole experience made me think more carefully about estate planning in today's complex world. I want to make sure that my legacy goes to the people I choose and that no one can manipulate or coerce their way into my family's inheritance. As for Jessica, the last I heard, she was facing trial on multiple felony charges and had moved out of state. Several of her children ended up going to live with their respective fathers, which was probably the best outcome for them. They were innocent victims in their mother's schemes, and I hope they can build healthier, more honest lives away from her influence. This whole experience was emotionally exhausting and financially costly, but in the end, I'm grateful that Jessica's true nature was exposed before she could do even more damage to our family. It's scary to think how much money and property she might have gotten access to if David hadn't learned the truth about her when he did. The most important thing that came out of this ordeal was a renewed closeness between David and me. Going through this crisis together and seeing how Jessica had tried to manipulate both of us in different ways helped us understand each other better and strengthened our relationship. Today, David is focusing on rebuilding his life and being the best father he can be to Emma. He's more cautious about dating but not bitter, which I think shows his resilience and good character. Emma continues to be the joy of my life, and knowing that my estate will eventually help secure her future gives me great peace of mind. Sometimes I wonder if I could have seen through Jessica's deception earlier, if there were warning signs I missed or questions I should have asked. But I've come to realize that people like Jessica are skilled manipulators who specialize in finding and exploiting the trust and generosity of others. The important thing is that the truth came out when it did, and our family emerged stronger and wiser from the experience. If there's one lesson I want people to take from this story, it's to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right, even in family situations. Don't be afraid to ask hard questions and verify information, especially when significant money or legal matters are involved. And remember that sometimes the people who seem most in need of help are actually the ones you need to be most careful around.